好的，各位，欢迎您继续关注到 TV32以及 AM936更多的节目内容。那么每一个月我们都会有一期特别的节目，那也是会和工党的党魁 Chris Hipkins， 也是我们的反对党的党魁，一起来讨论一下国会的观察。今天依旧啊，咱们的端午佳节迎接到的是 Chris。Hi Chippy, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah. Thank you for joining us today. And regarding the 2024 budget, I have seen your the criticism in the past weeks is man focusing on the public service, that the environment and also the education. We would like to delve deeper into these issues today. Is that okay for you?
Absolutely.
Okay, so first questions, we noticed the National Party claim this budget will be benefit 1.9 million families. So in your view, what's the high cuts in this budget actually harm New Zealanders?
Ultimately, it's not going to help New Zealanders in any way, shape, or form in the way that the National Party promised before the last election. They said that a family with 2 children on an average income would get $250 a fortnight through tax cuts. In reality, what they've delivered is, those families will be lucky to get $60 a fortnight in tax reductions. And the result of those tax reductions is actually increased costs for those families. So they're finding that as a result of the spending decisions of this government, their rates bill is going up, their rents are going up. If they're a mortgage holder, their interest rates are continuing to stay higher for longer. Their insurance bills are going up. And a lot of the day-to-day costs they face, such as public transport to get their children to school or picking up a prescription from the pharmacy, the cost of all of those things is going up as well. Early childhood education costs are going up. So I think most families are actually going to go backwards as a result of the government's budget.
But for example, everything you exampled is getting higher and higher price. But did you think the tax cut will be help the families much more better?
Ultimately, the tax cuts are likely to make the New Zealand economy, leave the New Zealand economy in a worse position because the government are primarily funding their tax cuts through borrowing. Nicola Willis's tax cut package overall costs about $14 billion. And she's borrowing $12 billion in order to fund that. So that's going to leave the country worse off. And that borrowing is almost unprecedented. Grant Robertson only ever borrowed more than that in one budget, and that was in 2020 when we were borrowing to keep the country afloat during the global pandemic. In terms of the deficits that the government are running, if you excluded the direct effect of COVID-19 wage subsidies and small business support, for example, Nicola Willis is actually running bigger government deficits than Grant Robertson ever ran. So, ultimately, they're doing a lot of damage to the New Zealand economy with some very bad budget choices.
So you're talking about the debt. We really, is curious about the New Zealand's current debt. The information we have a little bit unclean. Could you explain the debt change from Labour in power until now? Do you think this debt level is situation or sustainable?
New Zealand still has relatively low debt compared to other countries we compare ourselves to, such as Australia, the US, the UK, and so on, who have higher levels of debt than New Zealand does. The real question is, what is that debt funding? Now, during the COVID-19 period, in many cases, it was funding just keeping the country going, and you can justify doing that for a short period of time during an unprecedented event like a global pandemic. You can't justify continuing to borrow for your day-to-day costs on an ongoing basis. But you can justify borrowing for investment. So if your borrowing is to fund things like building new roads, building new schools, building new hospitals, building more houses, you can justify borrowing for those things. Unfortunately, that's not what the government are borrowing for. They're borrowing to pay for tax cuts. Were they borrowing to invest more in the future of the country, then actually I think there would be some justification in them doing that.
Could we know what was the debt we own now, the exactly amount?
Oh, I don't have the exact dollar figure off the top of my head, but debt has gone up. Let's make no bones about that. Debt went up over the last 5 years or so, but that was largely driven off the back of two things. One was responding to the global pandemic, and that was a very expensive thing to do. We had to fund, a whole lot of extra healthcare. We had to fund things like the vaccination program. We had to keep businesses afloat with things like the wage subsidy. All of that was very expensive.
So
but the other thing is we
one
significantly increased the government's capital investment. So we were spending more on areas like new hospitals, new schools,
Yes.
And upgrading roads and so on. And the result of that is, that costs money.
So could you give me a figure, like the labor in power? What was the amount, as you remember?
Oh, I don't remember it off the top of my head, the exact dollar amount.
Okay.
But the increase was certainly a manageable level within the overall context of the government's finances.
So now it's much more than before.
It certainly is more. Yeah, our debt increased significantly largely as a result of the global pandemic and the increased capital spending that we were making.
So what's your take on the issue of the tax cuts?
Ultimately, I think tax cuts are being done at absolutely the wrong point in the economic cycle. It's a tough time for households at the moment. Unfortunately, the government's decisions in this year's budget are making that even tougher.
Yeah.
So if you look at a thing called the fiscal impulse, which indicates whether the government's contributing to inflation or helping the fight against inflation, the fiscal impulse in this year's budget and next year's is positive, which means that they're adding to inflationary pressure rather than taking inflationary pressure away.
Okay, so if you think this budget will not help the New Zealand's economic growth, if still labor in power, what's the specific measures could you suggest, or what Labor will do?
I think we very much needed a budget of consolidation this year. This year's budget shouldn't have been a big spending budget. It wouldn't have been a big spending budget had Labor been re-elected. I was criticised during the election campaign for not promising enough in order to get re-elected. But the reality is we're not in a position to have a big spending budget right now. The government needed to make sure it was balancing the books. It needed a fairly steady budget that was predictable, where the level of investment that we're making in capital was continuing, and we kept that part of the economy afloat. The current government have done the opposite. They've actually tanked the building and construction industry through increased uncertainty, to the point where that industry is now writing to the government begging them to actually get back to work again. I think we needed to continue with that level of investment. And then we needed to steady the ship. So tax cuts right now was the wrong thing to do. I think we just needed to consolidate in this year's budget.
Okay, I agree with that. About the climate change, we have noticed the government instead to left the ban on oil and gas exploration. So how do you think this budget addressed the climate change and also the sustainability?
I think the issues around climate change are another example of where the government's taking New Zealand backwards and ultimately mortgaging the future that a future generation of New Zealanders is going to have to pay for. The previous national government under John Key signed us up to some agreements around reducing our emissions. And if we don't meet those targets to reduce our emissions, then we're going to have to pay. We're going to have to pay cash in order to compensate for not meeting our emissions reductions targets. Almost every decision the government has taken has reduced the chances that we're going to meet our emissions reductions targets, but they're not budgeting for the fact that we're then going to have to pay for that failure. And so that ultimately means a future generation. And when I say future generation, it's not that far away. It's the next 5 or 6 years. We're going to have to find money to pay for that failure.
But now we're much more far away than the target.
Absolutely. And, things like cancelling the clean car discount, but, bringing back oil and gas exploration, potentially reducing the proportion of our electricity that comes from renewable energy sources. These things are going to take us backwards, not forwards.
Okay. We know the Labour Party, the Labour policy have the free first year for the higher education. It's really good for all the students to hear. But now I see the National Party, they change to the last year. Did you think it's the better idea than the Labour's one?
Ultimately, it's just going to increase costs for students, and fewer students will now be eligible for it as a result of the changes that the government have made. Making the first year free is a good way of getting students into their tertiary studies and established in their tertiary studies. moving it to the last year means that ultimately fewer students are going to benefit from it, and that means that they're going to be borrowing more. The government is going to have to borrow more money to pay for more student loan borrowing as a result of this decision. So ultimately, it's just shifting more cost onto the next generation of New Zealanders.
But for their payment, I think they're same. The first year free or the last year free, the payment, nothing change. But the students, maybe they will finish the job, finish this education at the university. It's not better?
If that was true, they wouldn't be saving hundreds of millions of dollars by making this change. Ultimately, this change is designed to save the government money, and they're doing that by ensuring that fewer students benefit from that extra investment. So ultimately, it's taking money away from future generations of New Zealanders.
Okay. About the charter school, what's Labour's sense on the charter schools?
We're opposed to the establishment of charter schools. We don't think we need them in the New Zealand system. And I think it's somewhat ironic that the government is saying that we should have charter schools because schools need more freedom and more flexibility at a time when they're taking away freedom and flexibility from schools. They're imposing a much more top-down model of education policy making for state schools. And then they say, and we need to combat that by having more charter schools. It's a government of complete hypocrisy and contradiction.
Okay. I noticed you recently talking about your version for the 2014 at Labour's caucus. So what actions and plans does the Labour have to rebuilding after the election lose? Did you have any plan?
Yeah, so we're working at the moment. We've got to understand why New Zealanders didn't vote for us and what their hopes and aspirations for the future are. And we need to make sure that when we go into the next election, we've got some ideas that will compel New Zealanders to vote for us again. I mean, that's what politics is about. It's about making sure that what you're offering the public is something that the public see as attractive. So we've got to do some work around that. We will have a new policy offering before the next election, but it's not going to be in the next 18 months or so because there's still a lot of water to flow under the bridge between now and the next election. We've still got, the government have just delivered their first budget. They've got 2 more to go before the next election. So we've got to do a job of holding them accountable for the actions that they're taking. But we will be offering alternatives as well.
So in Labour Party will have the huge changes. For example, the people or the policy will have the very huge change?
We've already seen some quite significant change in terms of people. A number of our MPs have retired and a number of, high-profile faces have retired. Grant Robertson was the most recent of those. And, so you'll see a new lineup of people at the next election. It'll be a refreshed lineup. But you'll also see refreshed ideas as well. We're not going to be campaigning on the same things we were campaigning on in 2023. 2026 will be a different election campaign.
Okay. So in what area did you think New Zealanders needed to involve more to stay competitive internationally?
Well, it's not just about staying competitive internationally. It's about having the quality of life in New Zealand that we all aspire to. And I think one of the big challenges that we're going to face as we head to the 2026 election campaign is I think that we need to make sure that hard work in New Zealand pays off. For a long time, we've told Kiwis that the way to get ahead is to work hard. And the reality is there's a lot of Kiwis out there working really, really hard who don't feel like they're able to get ahead as a result of that hard work. Yeah. And so that's a real area of focus for me. That's core business for the Labour Party, making sure that hard work pays off.
Okay. So about the Cptpp is my last questions. What are the current views of the government or the Labour Party on the China joining the Cptpp?
Ultimately, for a new member country to join the Cptpp, then all of the existing members have to agree to that, and there's a process involved. And so ultimately, New Zealand will participate in that process, but it will be a matter of all of the countries in the Cptpp signing up to a new member entering. And I think they're working through that process at the moment.
So did you think your view and the current government will be different? Or
I can't really speak for the current government. I mean, New Zealand is certainly in favour of the trade opportunities that Cptpp opened up for us. We've been very proud of the huge progress that we've made as a result of our free trade agreement with China, and we should continue to always look at how we can ensure that trade between New Zealand and China is as open and as robust as possible.
Okay. Thank you for sharing the information. Thank you very much. Did you know today is very special for the Chinese community?
I did. It's a Dragon Boat Festival today. And
yes.
so can I wish all of your viewers a very happy Dragon Boat Festival. I hope it's an amazing day.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chippy, for joining us today. And we hope the next month we will see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lovely to talk to you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.